Welcome to What's New in OutSystems 10. In this session, we'd like to discuss all the new capabilities that have been included in OutSystems 10. A lot of the new capabilities revolve around mobile apps, which include being able to create new mobile user interfaces, also looking at the new mobile app architecture that includes the capability of doing offline, as well as using extensible components like plugins and other types of things. We also have the ability to generate a native app for iOS or Android. So a lot of really great things to talk about from a mobile app perspective. But we didn't leave out the website as well. There is an overall improvement in the developer experience, and that includes a number of new capabilities, as well as several improved existing capabilities. So let's go ahead and get started looking at all of the new capabilities. So when we think about what's new for mobile apps, we can begin comparing what we can do with mobile apps to what we can do with web apps in the past. So if we do a side-by-side comparison, we can see that the web apps were running server-side logic. They were storing things in the database, making synchronous requests from the browser to the server, and it was a request-response pattern where the page had to be refreshed each time, or at least a component of the page if we were using Ajax. Now, in our new mobile apps, we'll have server and client-side logic. So there will be logic that can run inside the device, as well as calling the server and having some of the logic run on the server. Data can be stored in the server-side database or in local storage on the device itself. And when requests are made from the device, they will be made to the server, and when they're made to the server, they're made asynchronously, so that we can make several of these requests in parallel, and then we can react whenever the data comes back. And the overall user interface is reactive itself. So if any of the data changes or we need to move to a different screen, the mobile app will attempt to handle all of that on its own, and it'll only call the server when it needs data or other information. So in general, you can refer to this whole new architecture as a common pattern that people refer to as a single page application. So our mobile apps will have a different look and feel and a very different way of interacting. So let's jump into the details of how all of that works. So there will be a number of improvements to the mobile interfaces. The mobile interfaces will have new templates, and there'll be a phone template, a tablet template, and a universal template. And those templates do have a common set of resources and patterns that are available to them, and will help us get started making really great looking mobile apps. To be able to do that, we start with the pattern, which is nice, but then the template, which is nice, but then we need to add patterns as we go along. So there have been dozens of mobile patterns that have been identified that are easy to use and are things that we would often want to add to a screen in a mobile device. So we may have things like different types of icons and tags. We may have counters and different types of buttons or floating actions that we want to make available on those screens. So these patterns will be available, they're easy to use, we'll be able to drag and drop them. They'll adjust to the form factor depending on whether it's the phone template or the tablet template, and they end up looking really great. So both the templates and the patterns are things that we've had in OutSystems 9 previously, and you may have heard them referred to as SilkUI templates and patterns, and SilkUI has now been extended to go ahead and help us in our mobile apps. And all of these templates and patterns are specific to mobile. We've also gone back inside of the Service Studio toolbox and looked at the baseline widgets that we have. And the baseline widgets for mobile apps have been changed or upgraded so that when we create a mobile app, the icons, the lists, the button groups, and other types of things will be a little bit different. They've been optimized for touch so that if we need to do gestures or different types of swiping, we'll be able to use those, and it'll be easy to do that. Now, some of the widgets are enabled for these types of swipes and gestures, and some of them aren't. So there has been a capability, a set of patterns added to be able to do gestures so that we can basically put in a gesture wherever we need to be able to do that, and we'll get slightly different behavior. Now, some of the widgets and the patterns, besides being able to handle gestures, will also have animation inside of them. So if we want something to sort of look more natural, the animation properties can be enabled or disabled depending on the type of look and feel that we want. And for some of the widgets that don't have animations, there is an animation pattern that we could apply to different types of widgets. And when these animations occur, we need them to look really smooth and great, so they all render at 60 frames a second. Now, that's the animations for the widgets and the patterns, which are sort of on a smaller scale. When we decide to navigate between screens, whenever we go to a new destination, we have the capability of sliding or fading into a destination. And depending on the type of transition that we choose, if we actually navigate back to the previous screen, it will reverse the transition. And this kind of makes it very natural for users to kind of begin understanding where the screens live and whether they're on the left or the right, and be able to swipe back and forth. So along with those user interface improvements, we have the capability of opening any screen. So if we create a mobile screen now and we want to look at any one of them, we don't have to go to the default screen immediately. We can open any one of the screens and jump to it very quickly. We also have the ability now to have expressions in our styles, and that gives us the capability of having dynamic styles that will react to the values of the expressions that we put inside those styles. So we can now have dynamic styles that will change as things inside of the application change. We also, when we drag and drop some of our patterns to the screens, we now have placeholders that can hold sample data. And that makes it easier to visualize the pattern, and overall it makes it very easy to work with. So it's a nice thing to have. So let's take a look at the new application architecture. Our new runtime architecture for mobile apps includes a model view controller pattern. So when we're going to run things on the client device, everything that's running on the client will be run inside of JavaScript, and it will have a model view controlling pattern that's inside of it based on React. And those React components will have the ability to run their own logic and have their own behaviors on the client side. It will be extensible. We'll be able to put Cordova plugins to access all of the native sensors and native capabilities. And when the device needs more information or data, it will be making REST calls back to the server. And as we begin developing these, when we see these interactions occurring, our platform is going to go ahead and generate the RESTful endpoints on the server side, and then go ahead and respond back to the device so it will get all the information that it needs. So two different sets of information. There can be logic on both sides. There can be data on both sides, because the device side can actually have local storage so that it can work offline as well. So let's look at a few more details of the runtime architecture. One of the things that's been added is there are new app events. When we create client actions, the app may need to know when the application has become ready, so the user has opened the app for the first time. And sometimes they'll open the app and then they'll close it. When the application resumes, we need to be able to know when the application is resumed so we can react to that as well. Now, once we know the app is open and we're able to work with it, we'll be on a particular screen. The screen has different lifecycle events that are now available. We need to know when the screen is beginning to initialize, when the screen is ready and the DOM is fully formed so that we're able to work with it, when the screen is going to render, and once all of that's done, if we no longer need the screen, when the screen will be destroyed. So these are events that are basically hooks that allow us to go ahead and create actions to respond to those steps inside of the lifecycle. And that gives us more control over how we can build our user interfaces. To continue to be able to do even more, we want to be able to use blocks and events. So the blocks are available as reusable components, and the blocks may have some sort of event that will signal changes to whoever the parent is. And typically we will put blocks inside of other blocks or inside of screens. And those events may tell them something that has happened and share certain types of data. And then the screen would have some sort of handler to go ahead and react to the event. So if we created a date picker block that allowed someone to pick a date, it could throw a date has changed event. So when the date changed event occurs, if any other component begins using the date picker, it would need to specify the following information about the date picker. It would need to specify what handler is going to handle the date changed event. And then it would create a local variable to go ahead and hold the new date that was going to be passed in to this particular method, because that's part of the event that's being thrown. So a lot of nice flexibility there so that we can create more modular components and smaller parts of screens and then have them interact with each other and interact with the screen in general. Now once the screen is defined and we have this life cycle and we know the different components that are in different areas of the screen, they're going to need data. And when they need data, the aggregates now are attached directly to the screen. And the aggregates can be opened, and when we open the aggregates, we can actually see the entity's attributes and how the entity data structure exists there. There are also these data actions for advanced cases, and whenever we make calls to either server aggregates, to local storage aggregates, or to these data actions, they're performed asynchronously. So all three of these calls can be made in parallel, and then depending on the size and the speed, they may come back at different times because they've been made asynchronously. So that means that the screen and the device will be getting its data at different points, and we want the screens to be as responsive as possible. So the UI elements are going to react to any local data changes, and those changes will occur immediately. There is this virtualization mechanism that will only render items that can be seen on the screen. So there's an optimization there so that we're not spending cycles doing things that can't be seen by the user. And then the UI will respond while the server is being called. So if we need some data, we can make the call asynchronously, but the UI isn't frozen waiting for that response to come back. We can continue to go on and do other things. So that makes the client-side user interface very reactive, and that's great. We also have logic on the client side, and those are client actions. And the client actions will be modeled visually. They have a slightly different set of icons, but we're going to be using the same knowledge that we had from OutSystems 9 to be able to go ahead and model these. We'll be able to drag and drop different types of actions, including server actions. And when we call the server, those RESTful APIs will be generated automatically for us. So we don't have to worry about the communication with the server directly. And then all those calls would be made asynchronously, as we mentioned. Now we also need the capability of handling exceptions a little bit better. So there are now on exception flows, and they have the same type of capabilities as action flows. And those will end up having exception handlers. So we can define the logic for any type of unhandled error, and then we can also send messages back to the user describing what type of exception has occurred and giving them more information. Another thing that's been added is that the module itself has a global exception handler, and that means that that will be the flow to handle any of the errors that haven't been caught up until that point. And then finally, we want the capability inside of our mobile apps to get to the native capabilities of the device. So we can add plugins to what we're doing at any given time, and that will give us access to what happens inside the device. There are some network capabilities as far as when we're going to be making these asynchronous requests to the server, how long should we wait before we time out. So because they're asynchronous, they sort of need to know and handle some of that themselves, and they need to be able to react to the network status. So because we're on a mobile device, sometimes we will be offline or we'll have a slower connection. They need to be able to know the type of connection and whether or not they're currently on or offline. And all of that is built in. And as we're developing for all of these things, we need to understand the types of calls we're making to the server, how often, and what could be happening that would affect our overall performance. So there are a new set of warnings that are available, and they basically try to detect all of the scalability and communication anti-patterns so that we know when we're doing something that may affect the performance of our mobile app. So anything that might delay the screen rendering, anytime we're making multiple server action calls together, we could probably bundle those up. So a lot of really good scalability warnings to help make sure our mobile apps will have great performance. Another thing we could do to improve the performance is not make as many server calls and store some of the data locally. So a new set of capabilities called local storage have been incorporated. So now we not only have database entities, but we can have local storage entities. And the local storage entities will hold all of their data locally, and the data will be available to the device at any given time. So they are very similar to the database entities. The only difference is that they're going to be stored locally on the device. We can still use aggregates to query that data, and we can actually take a database entity and say we'd like to duplicate it as a local storage entity to make it easier to copy the data back and forth from the device to the server. To be able to do all of that, we need some sort of synchronization approach or synchronization pattern. So to be able to do synchronization a little easier between our local storage entities and the server entities, there are some new actions. So the entity actions have the normal entity actions that you'd expect, but there's also a delete all and a create or update all. And those two new actions are there so that when we're taking all of something like the tasks on our device and we're trying to push them to the server, we can go ahead and create them all at once. Now there's also been a basic framework set up to help do synchronizations in general. So there are a number of client actions and there is a server action that have been built to kind of be the framework to be able to do that. So anytime we want to do a data synchronization, we can call offline data sync, and it will call server data sync. So we can learn more about that pattern later, but the synchronization framework is there, and it makes it a whole lot easier to do, which is great because offline can be a complicated thing to do. So that takes care of the new application architecture. What else do we have as far as extensibility? Well, you can go ahead and use native code inside of reusable plugins. So you can use Java or Objective-C or Swift, create some plugins, and then we can go ahead and incorporate the plugin into the mobile app. We also may want to take advantage of JavaScript because now we do have logic running on the client device and it's running inside of a React framework. Then we could add extra JavaScript and be able to work with that as well. So we can add JavaScript libraries for any types of information that we need, and then if we're working with those libraries and we need to edit some things, there's now a special JavaScript editor that has things like autocomplete and other things inside of it that make it really fun and easy to work with. There are also a number of other extensions. We have a new HTML widget that will let you create specific HTML components. We have CSS classes that will detect whether or not you're on the phone or the tablet and whether it's in the portrait or the landscape orientation. And that will allow our devices and our apps to react to how the device is being used a little bit better. Because there's a lot of JavaScript going on back and forth, we have the capability of doing JSON serialization and deserialization. So there are specific tools in the toolbox to be able to help us do that when we're inside of action flows trying to work with JSON. And then we have these things called UI extensions. So on any given type of component, we can add attributes or events to the widgets that are there. So we can get down to the attributes area and add things to them, and then they also can have events. So if we have something like an icon and we want to go ahead and add an on-click event to that icon, we can do that and then define which handler will be doing the work. So that gives us a lot of new capabilities to extend the base widgets and patterns that are there. Once we've done all of that, we'd like to be able to generate an app and be able to make it available on the App Store, or just at least take the bundle and go ahead and install it on our phone. So to do that for iOS, we need to go out and get a developer certificate and have a developer profile. And for Android, we basically just need to go out and register and get a key store. And once we have that, we'd be able to come in and click the generate button, and it will generate the apps. So once we've done our development, there is a generate tab that takes us into an area that allows us to generate the native mobile apps. And when that occurs, Service Center will actually keep track of when the native apps have been generated, if there were any problems, and it can help us sort of troubleshoot anything that might have been wrong with what was happening during the generation process. We also want to be able to keep track of the different versions. Now, as we're creating the mobile app, we know that OutSystems has its own versioning, and it will keep track of the application version for us, and we can tag that so we know when we're going to move it between different environments which version we're working with. But we also need to know the mobile version itself. And if the mobile version for Apple has a particular version number and the Android has a different version number, and we may need that to occur because we've generated them at different times, we can go ahead and keep track of all of that inside of Lifetime. And here you can see, at this point, the iOS, the app version, the Apple version of our application is on both and is available in production, where our Android is still in development and we would want to be able to deploy it to production. So besides the versioning, we also want to know when the application has been updated, do we actually have to create a new version of the app or not? So for a lot of UI logic and data changes, you won't need to go ahead and generate a new version and then put it out on the store or have people download it. There will be automatic updates inside the app because the shell will detect the changes, be able to download the changes from the server, and be able to work with them. And then while we're doing all of these updates and things in development, we'd like to be able to test them. So it'd be great if we could test inside of the development environment itself, test on the device if we need to, and that means we would need to go through this generation process, or we can use OutSystems Now. And for those of you that might be familiar with OutSystems Now, that will allow us to get to the different apps that are on the server, and you won't actually have to do the generation process, but you'll still be able to run the app in the device, which is kind of cool. So that takes care of all of the new mobile stuff, and there's an awful lot there. But that isn't all that was done for OutSystems 10. There were a lot more improvements as well. And that includes when we get into the application area, there are new icons. So we don't have to have all of the same looking icons if you don't create your own custom icon. Now you can go in and at least specify a color, and it will take some of the letters out of your application's name to begin giving it a custom icon. If you want, you can still upload your own icon, and it will select some of the base colors from that. There's also been an improvement to the toolbox. We used to have a very narrow and thin toolbox. Now we have a wider toolbox with larger icons, with easier labels to see, and we have the capability of searching for the different widgets or patterns that we're looking for. So because they are a little bit bigger, there's more scrolling that may occur. To keep you from having to scroll too much, the search is available. Now, there are some brand new capabilities that have been added. Now you can clone an extension. So you could always clone a regular module. Now you can clone a extension module as well. The exceptions have been upgraded so that when we go to the exceptions area, you can drag and drop an exception to a flow whenever you need to. And there's a new set of system actions that focus on lists, because we now may be sending information back and forth in large quantities. So there's a set of list actions that are available as both client actions and server actions. And this should make things a lot easier when we get stuck inside of loops dealing with lists. These should all help us. These actions, these operations should help us be able to do that much easier. Now, there's also a number of true change warnings that have been added so that we don't have a cluttered development environment. If there are a number of unused elements, it will warn us that, hey, maybe you changed something and you no longer need this element. So we'll be able to look at that and know, yes, I'm going to use it later, or no, it's truly an unused element. And if it is an unused element, why not just remove it? And we can do that on a per reference or on a per module basis. Along those same lines of removing things we don't need, it'd be great to be able to manage dependencies. And many times when we're working with different modules and we have dependencies, we might have multiple dependencies. And if some of them change at the same time, it would be great to refresh them without having to come in and click on each one. So there's the new refresh all button, which makes it a little bit easier to refresh all of our references at once. And the icons that are being used should make it a little bit easier to see when we do have a dependency that needs to be refreshed. Also, from a data perspective, when we're in Service Studio working with data, if we're in an aggregate and we'd like to be able to see more information about the contact entity, we can jump directly to the contact entity by hitting the new eyeball. We also want to be able to see sort of the data in the aggregate form from the entity. So now if you right click on the entity and say view data, it basically opens up the base entity and pulls back all of the information as if we had just a simple aggregate. And then again, the individual screens will now own the data and the calls to fetch data. So here our home screen is getting the contacts, and we can see that the contacts are coming from the local store, so it's a local contact, and that type hierarchy is right here so that we don't have to jump to the data tab to see what are all of the attributes for a contact. So that makes things a lot easier for us to drag and drop and build the screens quicker. We also will have to do more assignments, and the assignment mapping capability now has the capability of doing conversions. So if we have one element like a contact, and we know that we have a current list of users and the users and the contacts are similar, how will we map back and forth? And it will attempt to find attributes that are the same and map all of those elements. The other thing that we might have run into as a problem with the assignments is that a lot of times once you created one, to delete it, you had to delete both sides of the assignment. Now you can just select any assignment, right click and say delete that assignment, or use Control D, and it will take that whole assignment and remove it. And then from a readability and documentation perspective, we now have a little bit nicer expression editing capabilities. We can add single and multi-line comments anytime we need, and there is now parenthesis matching. So once you put in one parenthesis, it will highlight the other one so that you can see which sections of code you're working on. The switch has been improved so that you can put labels on all the different switch paths, and occasionally we might have dragged and dropped new elements into a flow and it would somehow misalign the overall flow, making it kind of annoying, and we'd have to go back and do some work to kind of do that. That's not going to happen anymore, so your flows will all stay nice, and all of your icons, if you keep them well aligned, will stay well aligned. And last, but certainly not least, there have been a lot of security improvements. All of the security best practices about code injection and redirects are inside the platform. The mobile authentication capabilities have been added. There have been new protections for brute force logins. There's advanced capabilities to configure the network and HTTPS now, as well as being able to specify that you want a strict transport policy. And you can also go in and talk about the content security policy. So there have been a lot of improvements in security as well. So that's a huge amount of new stuff inside of OutSystems 10. A lot of it is focused on all of our new capabilities to help us build mobile apps. but we also saw that there have been some improvements just in how the developer is going to work inside of Service Studio. So our experience as developers should be a whole lot easier and a whole lot quicker. So hopefully this gave you a great intro to what's new inside of OutSystems 10, and you'll spend some time playing with all of the new features.